darkness always has a sound. A sound that sometimes resembles the whisper of the night wind, sometimes a distant moan, and sometimes like the voice of a dog ordering you to kill from behind a wall. New York knew the summer of '76 through fear. A fear that tasted like bloody metal and smelled like gunpowder. A .44 caliber Glock would rise from the darkness and extinguish lives. On those nights, when the sound of police sirens shook the city, everyone knew someone had hunted again. Someone who called himself Son of Sam, a name that later became the nightmare of every dark street, every parked car, every glance in the rearview mirror. Today, I want to travel with you into the darkest corners of a killer's mind. An ordinary boy who never became ordinary since childhood. A man who talked to dogs in this video. You'll see how little David transformed from a lost child into a monster who fired his revolver like an act of worship. How the NYPD, for the first time in history, shut down the city to find a killer. And how the letters David sent to the police and newspapers became the key to unlocking the door to the hell of his mind. So if you're ready, let's go into the bloody nights where the Son of Sam hunted and the city breathed like a wounded animal. David Richard Berkowitz was born on June 1st, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. But he was an unwanted child from the very beginning. His mother, Betty Broder, a married woman, had a secret affair with another married man named Joseph Kledeman. When Betty got pregnant, neither party wanted to keep the child. His mother couldn't keep the baby with her because her husband knew about the affair and pressured her to give the child away. That child, David, was sent to a Jewish family for adoption a few days after his birth. His new parents, Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, took him to their home in the Bronx and tried to give him a normal life. But David never understood why his real mother didn't want him. They just told him, "Your mother died in an accident." David believed this lie for many years. David's childhood wasn't like any other kid's. He was a lonely little boy who didn't belong anywhere. Nathan and Pearl were a good couple, but their life had its own problems. Pearl developed cancer when David was about 14, and he was scared of the pain. Every night, he heard his mother's moans, a sound that echoed in the silence of their home. One night, David woke up, went to his mother's door, put his hand on the doorframe. His father was in the room, holding her hand and saying softly, "Everything will be okay, Pearl. Everything will be okay." But David knew it was a lie. He felt life was being stolen from him again, just like when his real mother had abandoned him. That night, David stood in the dark hallway and for the first time in his life, felt that the world was not a safe place, and no one could promise him they could save anyone. Pearl Berkowitz died in '67, David was 14. He never properly processed the grief of his mother's death in his heart. His father, Nathan, tried to get close to him, but he himself was drowning in sorrow. A few years later, Nathan remarried to a woman named Regina. David now felt like a stranger in his own home. Regina wasn't a bad woman, but David couldn't accept her. He could still hear his mother's moans in his mind, and now another woman had taken her place. The feeling of rejection flared up in his heart again. During those years, David began to withdraw. He gradually distanced himself from his friends, and he didn't talk much in school either. Teachers said he was a quiet kid, but there was something in his gaze that made people uneasy, an emptiness that seemed like it would never be filled. After school, David went into military service. He joined the U.S. Army in 1971. He thought maybe the Army could give him an identity, a place where he belonged, a place where they'd say, "You're one of us." But even there, David felt lonely. He had few friends, was mostly silent, and sometimes displayed strange behavior. One of his teammates, a guy named Robert, was sitting with David in the barracks one night. David was writing in a notebook. Robert laughed. "What do you mean? Your diary?" David closed the notebook and looked at him with eyes that had a strange coldness and said, "No, thoughts that tell me to write." Robert later said in an interview, "I was really scared that night. He looked at me like I wasn't there, like something else was passing through me." After the Army, David returned to New York, but this time he felt he was in a strange city. No one was waiting for him. His father had moved to Florida with Regina, and David was left alone in a small apartment in Yonkers. That period was the hardest of his life. He couldn't sleep at night. There were voices in his head. One of his neighbors, an elderly woman named Mary, said, every night, screams came from David's house, but then suddenly it would go silent. I thought he was having nightmares. David himself later said that those days were the worst of his life because he had no hope left for life. 1. I thought everything was meaningless. No one cared about me. My mother abandoned me. My second mother died. My father left, and I was left alone. Now he found out she hadn't wanted to be with him. David later said, the moment I found out the truth, something broke in my heart. Until then, I thought she wanted to be with me but couldn't. Now I found out she had abandoned me. This feeling of rejection, this pain, planted the seed of hatred and anger in his heart, a seed that later turned into the monster that terrorized New York City. David tried to contact his mother, but Betty spoke to him very coldly and briefly. I realized that no one in this world wants me. Not even the person who gave birth to me. This feeling of being discarded, this loneliness, caused David to gradually drift away from reality and sink into the dark world of his mind, a world where voices lived, voices that came from dogs. Around 75, David started behaving strangely. His neighbors said they heard him talking to someone at night, but there was no one. Tony moved a bit closer to the door and heard David's voice saying, "Okay, I get it. You want me to do the job, right?" Tony later told the police, "I thought he was talking on the phone, but then I realized there was no other voice in the house. He was talking to himself, or to something only he could hear." David later said in interrogations that his neighbor, a man named Sam Carr, had a dog named Harvey, and that dog talked to him. David said, "Harvey is a demonic dog. He relays the devil's voice to me, and the devil tells me what to do." Sam Carr himself, the man David claimed was the commander of his crimes, was an ordinary man who had nothing to do with this story. But in David's mind, Harvey, Sam's dog, had become the link between him and demonic forces. David believed the devil wanted him to shed blood to cleanse the world of corruption. He said, "The voice came every night. It said, 'David, go hunt, shed blood, prove to me you're a man.'" Psychologists later said David likely suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, meaning he actually heard these voices. But many still doubt whether the voices were real, or if he was just looking for a reason to justify his violence. The summer of '76 began with unbearable heat. The streets of New York were full of young lovers who parked their cars at night and spent time together. Parks, deserted streets, dark corners, places where couples went for moments away from the world's eyes. But that summer, the darkness held something else too. A silent hunter searching for victims with a .44 caliber bullet. David Berkowitz's first attack happened on the night of July 29th, 1976. Donna Lauria, 18, and her friend Jody Plowchant, 17, were sitting in a parked car in front of the Lauria family's apartment in the Bronx. It was 1 a.m. The air was still hot, and the girls were talking about their weekend plans. Donna said, "I think we should go to the beach this year. It's been a while." Jody laughed and said, "Yeah, only if the guys come too." Both laughed. Then, suddenly, a shadow passed by the car. Donna saw a young man approaching, dark hair, medium height, his hand in his pocket. Donna thought maybe it was one of the neighbors. But when the man reached the driver's side window, he took his hand out of his pocket, and there was a small pistol in his hand. Donna didn't even have time to scream. The sound of 6 shots shattered the night. The first bullet hit the window. The glass cracked. The second bullet hit Donna in the neck. Jody screamed, and Donna tried to open the door. The third bullet hit Jody's shoulder. David, without a word, without a glance, turned and walked into the darkness. Donna Lauria died that night in the hospital. Jody Plowchant survived, but was seriously injured. When the police arrived at the scene, blood was everywhere. One of the police officers, named John Fallon, later said, "That scene was something I'll never forget." A young girl, still sitting in the car, her head bent over the steering wheel, blood pouring from her neck. Her friend was screaming and saying, A man came, he just shot." We never understood why. Why would someone shoot 2 young girls for no reason? That night, New York met the son of Sam for the first time, though they didn't know his name yet. They only knew a killer was hunting in the city. Weeks passed, and the NYPD searched in the dark for clues. But there were no clues. David Berkowitz returned to his normal life after that night. He worked at the post office, went to work every morning, delivered mail here and there, and came home at night. His coworker said, "David is a quiet guy, doesn't talk much, but does his job right." No one would have thought that this quiet guy went out into the streets at night with a pistol and shot people. David himself later said, "After that night, I felt a sense of peace for a while, as if something screaming in my head had gone quiet. But after a few weeks, the voices started again, and this time, they were louder." On October 8th, 1976, about 3 months after Donna Lauria's murder, David struck again. This time, his victims were Carl De Niro, 20 years old, and Rosemary Keenan, 18 years old. They were also sitting in a parked car in the Flushing neighborhood of Queens. It was 2:30 in the morning. The street was deserted, and only the sound of crickets and the occasional distant car could be heard. Carl and Rosemary were talking about college. Rosemary said, "I think I should study psychology. I want to understand how people's minds work." Carl laughed and said, "So you want to know what I'm thinking about?" Rosemary said playfully, "No, you're too simple." Both laughed. At that exact moment, a shadow approached from beside the car and without any warning, began firing. The sound of the shots shattered the night. Carl screamed, "Get down!" and threw himself on top of Rosemary to protect her. The first bullet hit the back seat, the second hit the window, the third hit Carl in the side. Rosemary was pinned under Carl's body and screamed. David emptied his revolver and then, without a word, turned back into the darkness. Just like the last time, Carl De Niro and Rosemary Keenan survived, but both were injured. Carl was shot in his side and arm, and Rosemary was shot in her neck. When the ambulance arrived, Rosemary was still conscious. She told the nurse, a young man, he just came and shot. We didn't even see him. Why? Why did he do it?" The nurse had no answer. The police came to the crime scene, and this time, one of the detectives, named Timothy Dowd, told his colleague, "This is similar to that attack a few months ago in the Bronx. The same pattern, the same weapon, the same behavior. We're dealing with a serial killer." The news spread quickly through the NYPD. For the first time, the authorities realized someone was systematically hunting. But they still had no clues, no fingerprints, no witnesses, nothing, just the bullets, which were all .44 caliber, and the attack pattern, which was always the same: young couples, night, parked cars, and a silent revolver. Months passed, and New York gradually began to get scared. News of the attacks was all over the newspapers, but the police still couldn't find the killer. During this time, David Berkowitz continued his normal life, but he stayed up later at night. His neighbors said they heard footsteps from his house, sometimes crying, sometimes shouting. One neighbor, a woman named Esther, decided one night to knock on David's door. She was worried, thinking maybe David was sick. When she knocked, David opened the door. His face was sweaty. His eyes were red. Esther asked, "David, are you okay? I heard some noises." David looked at her with eyes that had a strange emptiness and said, "The noises." Esther later told the police, "That night I realized something was wrong with David, but I never thought he would do the things he did. He was just a lonely boy, or at least that's what I thought." On November 26, 76, David hunted again. This time his victims were Donna DeMasi, 16 years old, and Joanne Lamino, 18 years old. Two young girls sitting in a car in front of a cafe in Queens. It was 10:30 at night. The street was still busy. People were coming and going. Donna and Joanne were talking about a new movie. Donna said, "We should go see it. They say it's really good." Joanne said, "Yeah, but I'm scared of horror movies." Donna laughed and said, "You're scared of everything." Suddenly, the sound of a bullet shattered the window. Donna didn't even understand what happened. She just felt a sharp pain in her neck, and then everything went dark. Joanne was injured, but survived. She immediately jumped out of the car and started screaming, "Help! Someone shot us!" People on the street ran towards them, but David was already gone, vanished into the darkness again. Donna DeMasi was paralyzed. The bullet had hit her spine, and she could never walk again. Joanne Lamino received a superficial wound, but the psychological shock she suffered that night stayed with her for the rest of her life. She later said in an interview, "I never saw the man's face. I just heard the shots, and when I turned around, Donna was drenched in blood. That night I realized death is very close, much closer than we think." The NYPD was now certain it was dealing with a serial killer. 3 attacks in less than 5 months, all with the same weapon, all with the same pattern. The media began covering the story, and newspapers ran headlines every day. People began to get scared. Young couples no longer dared to sit in their cars at night. Deserted parks had emptied out. New York City, the city that never sleeps, now had a terrifying silence at night. The detectives formed a special task force called Operation Omega that worked solely on this case. The head of the task force, a detective named Ed Cuffalo, told his team in one meeting, "This man has a pattern, and we need to break that pattern. He attacks young couples, he works at night, and he always escapes before anyone can see him. We need to be ahead of him. We need to predict where he's going to strike." But how could they predict? David had no clear geographical pattern. He attacked in different neighborhoods, and there was no connection between his victims. The only common thing was that they were all young, and they were all sitting in cars. On January 31st, 77, David fired again. This time, his victims were Christine Freund, 26 years old, and her fiancé, John Deal, 30 years old. They were sitting in a car near a restaurant in Forest Hills, Queens. It was 12:30 at night. The air was cold, and a light snow had started to fall. Christine said to John, "I think we should go home. The weather is getting worse." John said, "Yeah, but let's just stay a few more minutes. I like being with you." Christine smiled and put her head on John's shoulder. At that exact moment, David came to the side of the car, raised his hand, and started firing. The sound of the bullets in the silent night was like thunder. The first bullet hit the window. The second hit Christine in the head. John screamed and tried to start the car, but the next bullet hit him in the face. Both were injured, but survived. Christine was shot in the head, but fortunately the bullet only grazed her skull and caused less damage. John was shot in the face, but survived. When the police arrived, both were conscious but in shock. John told the police it was a young man, brown hair, medium height. He just came and shot. We didn't say anything to him. Why? This time, the police had a clue, a general description of the killer. But it still wasn't enough. The newspapers now called the killer .44 caliber killer after the weapon he used. People were terrified, and the pressure on the police increased. The mayor of New York, Abraham Beame, said in a press conference, "We have provided the police with all available resources, and I promise the people of New York, we will find this killer." But weeks passed, and still no new clues were found. During this time, David had become a recluse, going out less. He said the voices had gotten louder, and now it wasn't just the dog Harvey talking to him, but other voices too. Voices coming from the walls, from the ground, from the sky. One of David's co-workers at the post office, a man named Frank, said to him one day, "David, are you okay? You look very pale." David looked at him and said, "I'm fine, I just can't sleep." Frank later told the police, "That day, I felt David was crumbling from the inside, but no one thought he was the killer." On March 8th, 1977, David fired again, but this time something was different. His victims were Virginia Voskerichian, 19 years old, and her friend, who were returning from a restaurant. It was 11:30 at night in the Forest Hills neighborhood, the same place where Virginia and her friend were walking towards their car, when suddenly Virginia felt someone was behind them. She turned around and saw a young man approaching. David Berkowitz, without a word, raised his hand and fired. The first bullet hit Virginia in the head. The girl immediately fell to the ground. Her friend screamed and started running. David shot at her too, but missed. Virginia Voskerichian was killed right there, on the sidewalk, under the streetlight. This was the first time David had fired in a public street, in potential view of witnesses. A woman watching from her apartment window later told the police, "I saw a young man running away. He had brown hair, was wearing a denim jacket. He was like a shadow. He left very quickly and disappeared into the darkness." Virginia Voskerichian's death was a turning point. This time, the killer had moved away from cars, had come out into the street, and the city could no longer remain silent. People were angry, saying the police were incompetent, saying the city was unsafe, saying something had to be done. The NYPD was under immense pressure, and the Operation Omega Task Force was working around the clock. Detective Cuffalo sat at his desk one night. The desk was covered with crime scene photos, reports, neighborhood maps. He told his colleague, "This man has a message. I'm sure of it. He doesn't just want to kill, he wants to say something." But what? The answer came soon, but from a place no one expected. On March 30th, 77, a letter arrived addressed to a journalist named Jimmy Breslin, one of New York's most famous journalists. The letter was handwritten, and the signature at the bottom was, "Son of Sam." For the first time, the killer had chosen a name for himself. The text of the letter was full of ambiguous sentences, threats, and allusions to future murders. David wrote in the letter, "I am the son of Sam. I die for you and I kill for you. My blood wants blood. I obey a God who commands me. The voices tell me to go, tell me to hunt, and I am obedient. New York, you are my city, and I am your hunter." The letter was published in the newspaper, and the city trembled. Now the killer had a name, Son of Sam. The media repeated the name. People went to sleep in fear at night, and the police were still in the dark. After sending that letter, David felt he had shown his power. He was no longer just a silent killer. He now had a face, a name, an identity. At night, he would sit in his house and read the newspapers, seeing the headlines. "Son of Sam threatens." Police searching for Son of Sam. City terrified by Son of Sam. Every time he read his name, he smiled. One of his neighbors, a man named Jerry, saw David reading the newspaper and laughing one day. Jerry asked, "Did you read something funny?" David looked at him and said, "Yeah, it's really funny." Jerry later told the police, "That day, there was something in David's look that scared me. A look like he was enjoying something others couldn't see." On April 7th, 77, David fired again. This time his victims were Valentina Suriani, 18 years old, and Alexander Esau, 20 years old. They were sitting in a parked car near a park in the Bronx. It was 3 in the morning. The night was very quiet, and only the sound of wind through the trees could be heard. Valentina and Alexander were talking about their future. Valentina said, "Where do you think we'll be in 5 years?" Alexander said, "I don't know, but I hope we're together." Valentina smiled. At that exact moment, a shadow came to the side of the car, and without any delay, 6 shots were fired. The first bullet hit Valentina in the head. The second hit Alexander in the head. Both were killed instantly. This time, David didn't flee. He stayed there for a moment, looked at the car, at the lifeless bodies, then took a deep breath and left. He later said in interrogation, "That night I felt free, like I had done a job I was supposed to do. The voices told me, 'Good job, David, you did your job well.' And I felt like I really had a purpose." The deaths of Valentina and Alexander sent a huge shock through New York City. Two young people, with their whole lives ahead of them, were killed for no reason. Valentina was a nursing student. She wanted to help people. She wanted to save lives. Alexander was an engineering student. He dreamed of one day building a bridge, a building, something that would last. Now, both were gone, and nothing remained but blood and memories. Valentina's father, a man named Antonio, couldn't speak at his daughter's funeral. He just cried. The NYPD was now under intense pressure. The mayor, the governor, even federal officials, everyone wanted this killer caught sooner. The Operation Omega task force grew to over 300 people, and police patrols circulated through all New York neighborhoods every night. But David was still one step ahead. He knew the police were looking for him, and this feeling gave him pleasure. He once wrote in his diary, "I know they are looking for me, but I am always in the shadows, always in the darkness. They can't find me because I am part of the night, and the night never dies." On June 26, 1977, David fired for the last time. This time his victims were Salvatore Lupo, 20 years old, and Judy Plouchant. Wait, was this a different Judy Plouchant? No, that's a mistake. The victims were Stacy Moskowitz, 20 years old, and Robert Violante, 20 years old. They were sitting in a car near a park in Brooklyn. It was 2:45 in the morning. The air was warm and humid, and only the sound of crickets could be heard. Stacy and Robert were talking about summer. Stacy said, "I think this summer will be better than last year. At least I hope so." Robert said, "Yeah, if this killer gets caught." Both laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, a laugh with fear underneath. At that exact moment, David came forward, emerged from the darkness like a shadow. He raised his hand and started firing. The first bullet hit the window. The second hit Stacy in the head. The third hit Robert in the eye. Robert screamed and tried to start the car, but it was too late. David emptied his revolver and then turned back into the darkness. But this time, something was different. There, Stacy Moskowitz died. Robert Violante lost an eye, but survived. The witness, a man named Tommy Zarino, immediately called the police and gave a description of the killer's car. For the first time, the police had a real clue: a yellow Ford Galaxy. The detectives began checking all registered Ford Galaxies in New York. There were thousands of cars, but they started checking them one by one. Weeks passed, but finally, on August 10th, 1977, the name David Berkowitz appeared on one of the lists. A yellow Ford Galaxy was registered to David Berkowitz, resident of Yonkers. But this wasn't the only clue that led the police to David. Something else happened, something that later became the key to solving the case. On the night of the attack on Stacy and Robert, one of the police officers, a woman named Officer Casey Meehan, was patrolling the same neighborhood. She saw a car. Officer Meehan wrote a ticket and placed it on the car's windshield. That car was a yellow Ford Galaxy. A few hours later, when news of the attack reached the police, and the witness said the killer had gotten into a yellow Ford Galaxy, Officer Meehan suddenly remembered. She immediately said, "I ticketed a yellow Ford Galaxy tonight, in that exact same neighborhood." This ticket, this small piece of paper, became the bridge between the police. When the detectives checked the name on the ticket, they saw it was the same name on the Ford Galaxy list: David Berkowitz. The detectives began investigating David's file. He had no criminal record, seemed like an ordinary guy, a postal worker, a simple life. But one detective, named John Fallon, decided to dig a little deeper. He went to David's neighborhood and started talking to the neighbors. One neighbor, the same Sam Carr, told the police, "David is a strange boy. He heard voices at night, talked to my dog. Once, he told me my dog talked to him, and I thought he was joking, but he was serious." These statements made the detectives more suspicious of David. They decided to put David's car under surveillance and wait for a legal reason to arrest him. On August 10th, 1977, the police decided to act. A special team went to David's apartment in Yonkers. It was around 6 in the evening. The sun was setting, and the air was still warm. David was coming out of the building to go to his night shift job when he suddenly saw several police officers standing in front of him. One of the officers, Detective Ed Cuffalo, stepped forward and said, "David Berkowitz?" David looked at them with eyes that held a deep wariness and said, "Yes, that's me." Cuffalo said, "We want to ask you a few questions." David smiled, a strange smile that seemed calm, and said, "I knew you were coming. The voices told me you were coming." The officers glanced at each other. Cuffalo said, "Can we see your car?" David handed over his keys without any resistance and said, "Of course, but I think you'll find what you're looking for." When the officers went to David's car, one of them looked through the window and saw a bag on the back seat. He opened the door and picked up the bag. Inside the bag was a pistol, a .44 caliber pistol. Next to it were some unwritten letters. Letters David intended to send to the police and journalists. One of the letters, Detective Cuffalo read the letter and then turned back to David and said, "You're the son of Sam." David nodded and with the same calm smile said, "Yes, I am the son of Sam. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of the voices. Maybe now that you're here, the voices will be quiet." David Berkowitz was handcuffed without any resistance and put into the police car. As they were taking him away, one of the officers said to him, "Why? Why did you do these things?" David looked at him and said, "I had to. The voices told me I had to do this. The neighbor's dog, Harvey, was the intermediary between me and the demonic forces. They wanted blood, and I gave them blood." The officer said nothing, just looked at him with a mixture of surprise and fear. How could a young man, an ordinary postal worker, become the monster who had killed 6 people and injured 7? How could a human being so simply become a serial killer who had terrorized New York City? When the news of the son of Sam's arrest spread, New York City breathed a sigh of relief. People celebrated in the streets. Some cried with happiness. Some just fell silent and looked at the sky. The victims' families also heard, but for them, this news brought no peace. Donna Lauria wasn't coming back. Valentina Suriani was gone. Stacy Moskowitz had left. Catching the killer couldn't bring them back. Donna Lauria's father, a man named Mike Lauria, sat on the couch and burst into tears when he heard the news. His wife put her hand on his shoulder and said, "It's over now." Mike shook his head and said, "No, it doesn't end. Donna is gone, and nothing can bring her back. This man can die, he can stay in prison, but my daughter is never coming back." David Berkowitz was taken to. David was willing to talk from the very beginning, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. In his first interrogation, which lasted 5 hours, he told them everything. Where he started, how he chose his victims, why he did it. Detective Cuffalo asked, "David, did you really believe a dog was ordering you to kill?" David looked at him with empty eyes and said, "I heard the voices. Voices coming from the ground, from the walls, from the air. They told me, 'David, you have to do this. You have to shed blood to cleanse the world.' And I thought if I didn't do it, the voices would kill me. I was scared. I was really scared." The interrogations continued, and each day David spoke more. He talked about his childhood, about how his mother had abandoned him, how his adoptive mother had died, how his father remarried and he felt rejected. David said, "My whole life, I felt like nobody wanted me. My mother abandoned me. My second mother died. My father left. I was alone, so alone. And that loneliness planted something in my head, something that gradually grew and turned into rage." Psychologists who examined David said he likely suffered from multiple mental disorders, including paranoid schizophrenia, severe depression, and antisocial personality disorder. But the main question was, did David actually hear these voices? Or was he just acting to escape punishment? One detective named Robert Drummond said to David in one interrogation session, "David, I want to understand what was going through your mind when you were shooting those girls and boys. What were you thinking?" David lowered his head and was silent for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I thought I was doing the right thing. The voices told me these people were impure, that they had to be eliminated. But then, when I fired the shot and saw them fall, something broke inside me. I felt like I was making a mistake, but I couldn't stop it. The voices would get louder, and I had to go again, shoot again." Drummond asked, "So you regret it?" David looked at him with eyes filled with tears and said, "Yes, I regret it every day. But what does regret bring back? Those people are gone, and I have to live with this heavy burden for the rest of my life." The interrogations revealed that David Berkowitz did not have a precise plan for his crimes. He would just go out at night, wander the streets. And whenever he saw a parked car with a young couple, he would attack them. He said, "I didn't know who I was going to shoot. I would just go out, and the voices would guide me. They would say, 'There. Go there, see them. They are the targets.' And I would go." This random method was why it took the police so long to find a pattern, because there was no clear connection between the victims. They were just random, just happened to be in that place on that night. The detectives asked David about the letters he sent to the newspapers and the police. David said, "I wanted everyone to know who I was. I wanted to have a name. I wanted people to know me. My whole life, I was an invisible person, someone nobody saw. Now everyone knew me. Everyone was afraid of the son of Sam, and that gave me a sense of power." These statements showed that David was not only a killer, but also a narcissist who enjoyed the fame and attention. Psychologists said this behavior is common for some serial killers who want to connect with society, who want to be heard, who want to know they exist. One of the shocking moments of the interrogation was when David talked about the night of Donna Loria's murder. Detective Cuffalo asked, "That night, when you shot Donna and Jody, what did you feel?" David was silent for a moment, then said, I remember my hand was shaking. It was the first time I had shot a human being. Before that, I had only practiced with cans and cardboard. But that night, when I came to the car and saw two young girls sitting there, something in my head said, now is the time. I raised my hand and fired. The sound of that girl's scream, the sound of breaking glass, the smell of gunpowder, everything was like a nightmare, but a nightmare I was living. Cuffalo asked, "What did you do after?" David said, "After, I went home, sat on my bed, and cried. I cried for those girls, for myself, for everything. But the voices told me, 'Good job, David. You've started your work. Now you must continue.' And I continued." The interrogations went on for weeks, and each day, more details were revealed. David described each attack, how he would follow his victims, how he would wait for the right moment, how he would shoot and then flee. He said he never intended to wound anyone. He only wanted to kill, because the voices had told him only death cleanses. But a few times, luck was with the victims, and they survived. David said, "Every time I saw someone had survived, I felt like I had failed, that I hadn't done my job properly. ... The voices would get angry and tell me, 'You are a failure. You must be better.' One question the detectives kept asking was, 'Why couples? Why did you always attack people who were together?' David answered, 'Because I was alone. I never had anyone to love me, to be with me. When I saw two people sitting together, laughing together, I felt they had something I would never have. And that feeling was envy, an envy that turned into hatred.' His statements showed that David's crimes were rooted in his personal feelings of rejection, loneliness, and an inability to form emotional connections. Psychologists said David had suffered psychological trauma from childhood, and these traumas had gradually turned into rage and violence. In one interrogation session, Detective Drummond said to David, "David, if you could go back to the past, would you change anything?" David looked at him with eyes full of regret and said, "Yes, I would change everything. I wish I could tell my younger self that rejection isn't the end of the world, that there is still hope." But before the trial, something else happened that shocked everyone. David told his lawyer in one session that he wanted to plead guilty to all charges. He didn't want to go to trial. He didn't want to waste anyone's time. His lawyer, a man named Leon Stern, tried to tell him it was the wrong decision, that he could use an insanity defense and maybe get a lighter sentence. But David said, "No, I don't want to run away. I did these things, and I must be punished for them. The victims' families have the right to see me punished." This decision by David meant the trial would proceed much faster than usual. On May 30th, 1978, David Berkowitz entered the courtroom. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' families, and the curious who wanted to see the face of the son of Sam up close. David entered in prison clothes, handcuffed, his head down. He sat in his chair and looked around. For the first time in months, he saw the eyes of his victims' families. Eyes filled with pain, anger, and hatred. One of the mothers, Stacy Moskowitz's mother, a woman named Nita Moskowitz, sat in the front row, and when she saw David, she began to cry. Her husband put his hand on her shoulder and tried to calm her, but Nita couldn't stop. She whispered, "That's the man who killed my daughter. That's him." The judge, a man named Joseph Corman, entered the room and everyone stood. Judge Corman sat in his chair and looked at David. Then he said to the prosecutor, "Please read the charges." The prosecutor, a man named Eugene Gold, stood up and began reading the charges. David Richard Berkowitz, charged with 6 counts of murder in the first degree, 7 counts of attempted murder, and assault with a deadly weapon. Then he turned to David and asked, "Mr. Berkowitz, have you heard these charges?" David lifted his head, looked at the judge, and said in a quiet but clear voice, "Yes, I have." The judge asked, "What is your plea?" David took a deep breath and said, "Guilty. I plead guilty to all charges." The courtroom fell silent for a moment. Then murmurs arose. The judge banged his gavel and said, "Silence." Then he turned to David and said, "Mr. Berkowitz, you understand that by pleading guilty, you are waiving your right to a trial." David said, "Yes, I know. I don't want to waste anyone's time. I did these things, and I must be punished for them." Judge Corman looked at him for a moment, then said, "Very well, in that case, we proceed to sentencing. But before that, I want to hear from the victims' families. If anyone wishes to speak." His eyes were red from crying, but his voice was firm. He said, "My daughter Donna was a beautiful and kind girl. She was 18, her whole life was ahead of her. She wanted to be a teacher. She wanted to help children. She wanted to live. But this man, this monster, took her from me. With one bullet, one night, he destroyed my daughter's entire future. I wake up every day, and the first thing I remember is that Donna is gone. There, I will never hear her laugh again, never see her get married, have children, live her life, and all for what? Because of a man who says his neighbor's dog told him to kill. Mike Loria's voice rose. He shouted, "That's not a reason. That's not a justification. It's just an excuse for a man whose heart is full of hatred." Then he turned to David and said, "I will never forgive you. Never. You should spend the rest of your life in prison and think every day about what you did." After Mike Loria, Nita Moskowitz stood up. She was a petite woman, but when she started speaking, her voice was full of power. She said, "Stacy was my daughter, my only daughter. She was 20 years old. She was in college. She loved music. She loved life. The night I got the news, I thought the world was ending. I went to the hospital. I saw my daughter lying on the bed, her head covered in bandages, and the doctor told me she wouldn't wake up. I held her hand, kissed her, and talked to her, but she never answered. A few hours later, she was gone." Nita's voice broke. She cried, but continued, "I don't understand how a human being can do this. How can you shoot a young girl who has done nothing wrong? How can you sleep at night after killing someone?" She turned to David and said, "You have to live with this sin, and I hope you have nightmares every night, that you hear the screams of your victims every night, that you think every night about the monster you became." One by one, the other families spoke. Valentina Suriani's father, Virginia Voskarishian's mother, Alexander Esau's family. They all came and shared their pain. Each one told how their lives had been destroyed, how they could never have a normal life again, how they woke up every day with the memory of that terrible night. The courtroom was filled with crying, pain, and anger that had built up for years. But he said nothing. He just listened. After the families had spoken, Judge Corman turned to David and said, "Mr. Berkowitz, do you have anything to say?" David stood up, his handcuffs clinking, and he stood before the microphone. He looked at the families, then said in a trembling voice, I don't know what to say. No words can lessen your pain. No apology can bring your loved ones back. I just want to say that I am truly sorry. I think every day about what I did, and I hate myself every day. I don't know why I did it, why I couldn't stop it. I just know that I now have to live with this burden, and nothing can save me." Then he turned to the judge and said, "I am ready for my punishment, and I accept whatever the court decides." Judge Corman was silent for a moment, then said, "Mr. Berkowitz, you have pleaded guilty to 6 counts of murder in the first degree and 7 counts of attempted murder. According to the laws of the state of New York, I sentence you to 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your life in prison." The sound of the judge's gavel echoed, and the sentence was issued. David lowered his head and said nothing. The officers came and led him out of the room. As he was leaving, one of the family members shouted, "I hope you burn in hell." David didn't turn back. He just left, and the door closed behind him. The news of David Berkowitz's conviction spread quickly throughout New York. People felt relieved, felt that justice had been served. But the victims' families felt no relief. For them, this was just an end, not a salvation. Their loved ones weren't coming back. My Donna is gone, and I have to live with that fact for the rest of my life. Nita Moskowitz also said, I hope David Berkowitz thinks every day about what he did, and I hope he never finds peace. David Berkowitz was sent to Attica Prison, one of the toughest prisons in New York State. There, he began his new life, a life behind iron bars. In the first days, David mostly stayed in his cell, didn't speak, just sat and stared at the wall. The other inmates knew who he was, and some hated him, some feared him. One inmate, a man named William, approached David in the yard one day and said, Are you that killer who terrified all of New York? David looked at him and said, Yes, I am. William laughed and said, Well, we're all killers here, but at least we had reasons. You? You killed people because of a dog? David said nothing, just turned and went back to his cell. He knew William's words were right. Years passed, and David Berkowitz gradually adjusted to life in prison. He began reading books, participating in prison educational programs, and even started writing. He wrote letters to the families of his victims, letters full of apology and remorse. But most of these letters were never answered. The families didn't want to hear from him. They didn't want any connection with the person who had killed their loved ones. Only one family, the family of Jody Plauchent, the girl who had been wounded in the first attack but survived, sent a letter to David. The letter said, I read your letter, and I have to say that I still hate you. But I want you to know that I have forgiven you, not for you, but for myself, because hatred only burns me up inside, and I don't want to live the rest of my life with this feeling. When David read this letter, for the first time in years, he felt that perhaps there was hope. Perhaps there was. In prison, David began studying religious books. He became a committed Christian and claimed he had now dedicated his life to God. He said in interviews he later gave, I realized that the voices I heard were demonic voices, not the voice of God. I was deceived, and because of that deception, I committed terrible crimes. But now I know that God has forgiven me, and I try to be a better person every day. These statements from David led some to believe he had truly changed, but others said it was just an act, just an attempt to gain sympathy. One journalist who met with David in prison several times, a woman named Maura Kennedy, later said, When I spoke with David, I felt that part of him was truly remorseful, but another part of him was still the son of Sam, still the one who enjoyed fame and attention. He likes people talking about him. Maura's observation suggested that David may never have truly changed. He just learned how to act. Over the years, David applied for parole several times, but each time his request was denied. The victims' families would come and protest every time a parole hearing was held. Mike Loria would come each time and say, This man killed 6 people, injured 7 others, and terrorized a city. He should never be released, and the parole board would listen to these statements each time and decide that David must remain in prison. The last time David applied for parole was in 2022, and his request was denied again. He is now 70 years old and will likely remain in prison for the rest of his life. But the story of David Berkowitz isn't just the story of a killer. It's also the story of a city that learned how to cope with fear, how to find solidarity. New York changed after David's arrest. The police implemented new security systems, night patrols increased, and people learned to be more cautious. But more importantly, this story showed how one person with a pistol and a sick mind could bring an entire city to its knees, and how a city could rise again. David Berkowitz is still alive today, still in Attica prison, still living with the memory of his crimes. He sometimes gives interviews, sometimes writes letters, and sometimes talks about his past. But for the victims' families, he is nothing but a monster, someone who took their loved ones and can never make amends. This story is a reminder of how rejection, loneliness, and mental illness can turn into violence, and how violence can destroy countless lives. Now, let's go back to that night of August 10th, 1977. The night David Berkowitz was arrested. The moment the police saw him, the moment he smiled and said, "I knew you were coming," was a moment that stayed with the detectives forever. Detective Ed Cuffalo later said in an interview, "When David said that sentence, I felt we were dealing with someone who was relieved to be caught. It was as if he was tired of running, tired of the voices, tired of his double life." This observation was correct, because David later said that on that day, when he saw the police, he felt a sense of peace. He felt that finally everything was over. But why did David confess so easily? Why didn't he resist? Why didn't he try to exonerate himself? Psychologists who later examined David said that David probably wanted to be caught from the very beginning. That he wanted his story to be heard. He wanted people to understand who he was and why he had done it. Dr. David Abrahamson, one of the psychologists who examined David, said, "David Berkowitz was a narcissist who enjoyed attention. He didn't just want to be a killer. He wanted to become a legend, a name that would remain in history forever." And in a way, he achieved this goal. This point is very important because it shows that David was not only a killer, but also someone who didn't fear fame. He was thirsty for it. The letters he sent to the newspapers, the name he chose for himself, all of this was part of a plan to be seen, to be known. And unfortunately, his plan worked. Today, more than 40 years later, the name Son of Sam is still recognized. His stories are still told, and movies and books are still made about him. And that's exactly what David wanted. But let's return to the main question. Why did David Berkowitz become a killer? Were the voices really what compelled him, or was it something else? Psychologists say that David had likely suffered psychological trauma since childhood. Being rejected by his biological mother, the death of his adoptive mother, feelings of loneliness and not belonging. All of these gradually turned into a deep rage that David couldn't control. The voices he said he heard were probably hallucinations stemming from paranoid schizophrenia. But these hallucinations were just a reason, not the root cause. The root cause was the pain and suffering David had lived with for years. Pain that no one saw, no one treated, and which ultimately turned into violence. One interesting fact that later emerged was that David had tried to seek help before starting his killings. He had gone to a psychologist once and said he heard voices, but the psychologist thought David was exaggerating and just gave him an antidepressant. David had also gone to a priest another time and said he felt demonic forces were talking to him. But the priest thought David was just having a spiritual crisis and told him to pray more. None of these attempts led anywhere, and David was left alone with his voices, alone with his pain, and finally, alone with his pistol. This story is a reminder of how important it is to pay attention to the signs of mental illness, how important it is to listen to people who are crying out for help, and how important it is to provide timely treatment. If someone had helped David, if someone had seen his pain, perhaps the son of Sam would never have existed. Perhaps Donna Luria would still be alive. Perhaps Valentina Suriani would be raising her own children. Perhaps Stacy Moskowitz would be playing music. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And we are left with a tragic story. A story that shows how a lonely boy turned into a monster. The interrogations of David Berkowitz continued even after his conviction. The police wanted to be sure whether David had acted alone or not. David had said from the beginning that he was alone, that no one else had collaborated with him. But some detectives were skeptical. They said some witness descriptions didn't match, that perhaps more than one person was involved. One detective, named John Sanson, said years later in an interview, "I still think there are things David hasn't told us, things he's kept hidden, but we could never prove that anyone else was involved." David himself later, in the 1990s, began to change his story. He said that maybe he wasn't alone, that maybe a satanic cult was involved, that maybe he was just a tool in the hands of larger forces. These statements caused some people to look at the case again, but no evidence was ever found to confirm these claims. Most experts say this change in story was likely another attempt by David to attract attention again, to keep his name alive. David always wanted to be the center of attention, and even in prison, he continued this desire. One shocking aspect of this case was the letters David wrote in prison. He not only wrote letters to the victims' families, but also to his fans. Yes, fans. Unfortunately, like many other serial killers, David Berkowitz also gained boy. These people would send him letters, send him photos, even propose marriage. David would reply to some of these letters, and sometimes even maintained pen pal relationships with some of these individuals. One of these individuals, a woman named Jennifer, later said in an interview, "I think David was an abused person, someone society gave up on, and who was forced to do these things. I want to show him that there is someone who understands him." This kind of thinking shows how some people can romanticize even the worst criminals, how they can forget the victims and only think about the killer. Returning to the arrest story, there's another interesting point. When the police searched David's car, they not only found the pistol and the letters, but also a map with several locations marked on it. These locations were places David had planned to choose for his future attacks. One of these places was a park in Manhattan, a place usually full of young couples at night. The detectives later learned that David had planned to go to that park that very week, on Friday night, and hunt again. If the police had arrived one day later, there might have been new victims. This fact made everyone feel how lucky they were that David was caught earlier. One of the officers present at the arrest, an officer named Michael Novogratz, later said, "When I saw that map, the hair on my body stood on end. This man not only had no intention of stopping, but he was planning more attacks. I think if we hadn't caught him, he could have killed dozens more people. He was a killing machine that had no intention of shutting down." After the arrest, the NYPD held a major press conference. The police chief, Michael Codd, stood in front of the cameras and announced, "We are happy to announce that the son of Sam has been arrested. David Berkowitz, the 24-year-old man responsible for 6 murders and 7 attempted murders, is now in the custody of the NYPD. I want to thank all the detectives who worked on this case day and night, and also the citizens who helped us." The sound of applause and cheers rose from the reporters, and people gathered outside the police building. For the first time in a year, the people of New York felt safe. After the arrest, the NYPD held a major press conference. The police chief, Michael Codd, stood in front of the cameras and announced, "We are happy to announce that the son of Sam has been arrested. David Berkowitz, the 24-year-old man responsible for 6 murders and 7 attempted murders, is now in the custody of the NYPD. I want to thank all the detectives who worked on this case day and night, and also the citizens who helped us." The sound of applause and cheers rose from the reporters, and people gathered outside the police building. For the first time in a year, the people of New York felt safe. Now, let's go back to the day of the trial, the day David Berkowitz stood before the judge and confessed to all charges. That day, May 30th, 1978, was a day forever etched in New York's history. After the judge issued his sentence, David was taken out of the courtroom. In the hallway, a reporter managed to get close to him and ask, "David, now that you've been convicted, how do you feel?" David turned, looked at him and said, "I feel like everything is finally over. I don't need to run anymore. I don't need to hear the voices anymore. Now I can rest. This statement showed that David was satisfied with his conviction, as if he himself wanted this dark journey to end. David's life in prison began with hardship. In the first days, he was in a solitary cell because the police were worried other inmates might try to harm him. It was during those days that David began writing his diary, a journal parts of which were later published. In that journal he had written, "I am now where I belong. It is dark here, cold and lonely, but this is the place I deserve. I killed innocent people, and now I must stay here for the rest of my life. Perhaps this is the only way I can atone." The first months in prison were very difficult for David. He had nightmares at night. Nightmares in which he saw the faces of his victims. He later said, "Every night I heard Donna's scream. I heard Valentina's crying. I heard Stacy's pleas. They were no longer voices ordering me to kill." David suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder and will likely live with these nightmares for the rest of his life. But this is part of his punishment, a part no judge can sentence him to, because his own mind is sentencing him. After a few months, David was transferred from solitary confinement to the general prison population. There, he began interacting with other inmates. Some avoided him. One inmate, a man named Carlos Rodriguez, later said, "David was a quiet guy, didn't talk much, but when he did speak, you felt a heavy burden on his shoulders. Once he told me he asks God every day to forgive him, but he doesn't know if God really does. I told him God forgives everyone if they are truly remorseful, but I don't know if he believed it." In 1983, David was attacked in prison. Another inmate, a man whose sister had been injured in one of David's attacks, attacked David's throat with a knife. David was injured but survived. This attack caused David to be sent back to solitary confinement for a while. After this incident, David said in an interview, "I realize that everyone hates me, and I can't blame them. If I were in their place, I'd probably do the same. I am a monster, and monsters don't deserve to be forgiven." This incident led David further towards religion. He began reading the Bible, attending religious meetings in prison, and even started preaching to other inmates. The prison chaplain, a man named Father James Patterson, later said, "David had truly changed. He was no longer that young man who talked to voices. He was now a man who talked to God, who was seeking salvation. I don't know if God has forgiven him, but I saw that he was genuinely trying." But not everyone believed in these changes. Some said David was acting, that it was just a performance so that maybe one day he could get parole. The victims' families never believed in these changes. Mike Loria once said, "I don't believe David Berkowitz has changed. He is the same man who killed my daughter, and nothing can change that fact. He can read dozens of Bibles, but that won't bring Donna back." Years passed, and David gradually became a well-known figure in prison. He began writing articles about his experiences, about mental illness, about how society should help people suffering from mental illness. Some of these articles were published in various publications. and some were even used in psychology training courses. But again, many said this was just another attempt by David to put himself on display, to be the center of attention again. One interesting point David made in his writings was this: mental illness is not an excuse for crime, but it is a reason. I am responsible for the things I did, but society is also responsible for not helping people like me. I tried many times to get help, but no one really listened. Now, I want my voice to be heard, not to exonerate myself, but so that perhaps I can prevent another David. These sentences showed that David at least wanted to draw something positive from his dark experience.